Buongiorno a tutte e tutti, benvenuti e benvenuti. Io sono Massimo Curioli, sono il presidente del corso di laurea in ottica e ottometria dell'Università di Firenze e con oggi iniziamo il primo webinar di questa stagione di webinar del 2025. Dunque, il webinar sarà in inglese, quindi fra un po' passerò in inglese. We have as a speaker David Peterzell, who is a professor from Los Angeles. We are very happy to have him in this series of webinar. So we will open the session. The webinar will be in English, but now I switch in Italian because I have to explain you some details. Allora ragazzi e ragazze, quello che vi devo dire è che per chi segue il webinar nel PCTO dell'università deve riempire un form perché noi dobbiamo registrare le vostre presenze, sia per gli universitari che per i ragazzi che ci seguono dalle scuole superiori. Quindi ora la regia metterà il link del form Google che dovete andare a aprire. Se lo aprite trovate una schermata di un form Google in cui la prima parte, come vedete, c'è scritto il vostro nome e il vostro cognome, dovete scrivere e indicare la scuola da cui provenite. In fondo ci sono le università. Ci dovrebbero essere tutte le scuole da cui potete provenire. Se per caso ne ho dimenticata qualcuna, proprio in fondo alla lista trovate altro e lì scriverete il nome della vostra scuola. Questo riguarda appunto la parte iniziale. Dopodiché, per i ragazzi delle scuole superiori e solo per loro, abbiamo un test, cioè alla fine del webinar dovrete rispondere a 3 domande che David ha presentato a risposta multipla. Quindi trovate 3 domande lì nella sezione in fondo al form dove trovate test e ogni domanda ha 3 risposte. Una sola è la risposta giusta. Noi registreremo le vostre risposte e quindi prenderete una votazione da 0 se le sbagliate tutte a 3 se le indovinate tutte. Poi questi dati saranno comunicati alle vostre scuole, le quali li useranno, diciamo, per stabilire quali sono i vostri punteggi e non so bene come funziona. L'altra cosa che vi voglio dire, poi passo all'inglese, è che come avete visto è una serie di webinar con tanti appuntamenti, sono tutti registrati, li dovreste trovare, la vostra scuola ne è a conoscenza e il prossimo, quello che avremo il 24 di ottobre, sarà fatto da un artista, un pittore che si è appassionato al problema del daltonismo, diciamo così, e il fatto che non tutti hanno una visione dei colori identica alle persone cosiddette normali e discuterà come questo fatto ha delle importanti conseguenze anche dal punto di vista sociale e al fatto della sua carriera artistica, perché lui ora sta cercando di creare delle opere d'arte che seguano dei criteri di inclusione anche di questa parte della popolazione, che nel mondo sono 400 milioni, quindi non sono proprio pochissimi. Now I switch English because I have to say something about David. David is a very famous expert in cognition. He's did a lot of study in different directions. Today I asked him to give a webinar on this topic, which is the fact that the reality we see by our vision is something that the brain has a lot to do with it. And so the title, you see, what we see depends on what we know. So it means that our memory, our experience are very important in what we see in vision. Now, the webinar is organized in the following way. David will start and will give a lecture for 20 minutes or so. Then we will stop and I will ask you from home to ask questions. You may ask questions, just fill in the chat, and there are no stupid questions. Any question is a good question. So you can say, I do not understand this part, and then we will try to be more clear. So don't be shy, try to make questions, because this is the important part of our job. Then we will start with David. He will introduce some other concept, and at the end, after 50 minutes, more or less, there will be a long part of questions, let's say of the order of half an hour, and in this part, you may ask questions, you should ask questions, and then we have three experts, I would say, so three colleagues that will ask questions like I'm doing now, speaking in the webinar. So we have Michelle Galli, she is a student of the master student of psychology. Then we have Paolo Grasso, which is a researcher working in our department of physics, but with an extraction of psychologists also. And finally, Roberta Righi is a professor of the university in, again, cognition and psychology. So I think I have said all the things I had. So now I'll stop here, and David, you may start with your presentation, please.
Thank you so much. The title of the talk is What We See Depends on What We Know, Cognition, Color, and Context. And I put this together. It's actually a fairly simple, straightforward presentation about some issues related to what we call top-down processing or perceptual influence. The idea that a lot of what we see is actually a product of us as opposed to what's coming in, which is what we think of as top-down as opposed to bottom-up processing, which I'm going to talk about. I'm a professor at a place called Fielding Graduate University, which is actually a place where I'm a cognitive scientist, but I'm also a clinical psychologist, and now I'm also a visiting professor here. And so I'm quite grateful to be here. And what I normally do, and what in this group, what we tend to do, is we're interested in vision science, which is the study of the eye, the brain, and resulting perception. And we're interested in things like how does it work? How does the system work when it comes, and what are the codes for processing things like color and 3D depth, motion, face recognition? And we use techniques called things like what are called visual psychophysics, where we relate something about the physical stimulus, about the light, maybe the wavelength or what have you, to the psychological perception of it. So it's a fairly quantitative discipline. And then we also try to understand the brain mechanisms underlying it. And so, in these pictures, it's the basic idea. How do we go from something that's outside of us to some sort of representation inside of us that may or may not be related to what's outside of us? And we start with this picture from Descartes, where he was interested, he kind of put his ideas together about what he knew about optics and an image forming on the back of the eye going into the brain. And this is the sort of thing that I've done in the past as well. So for instance, in this case, we're measuring brain waves, what are called evoked potentials, with babies. And this is a picture of my colleagues from many years ago. And you have a pattern, you get the baby's attention, the pattern is flickering on the screen. Or you just simply have, on the lower screen, you're just looking at the baby's eye movements. You might have electrodes on the scalp measuring brain waves. And from there, we can make inferences about what people, in this case babies, see and the processes underlying them. So that's what I'm normally doing. And just to let you know, I found out a number of years ago that I actually do have a normal brain. This is I think it's an fMRI, and so anyway, that's what we're starting with. But what I want to talk about today is some very basic ideas. We tend to go about the world as naive realists. We think we're seeing the world exactly as it is, but perception is shaped as much by the mind as by the light in the eye. And that's what I wanted to say a little bit about today with my limited amount of time. So we're talking about what are called top-down processes, as opposed to, so bottom-up, light comes into the eyes, receptors transduce that into electrical energy, electroactivity goes through various cells with certain receptive field profiles, and ultimately you end up somewhere high up in the brain, and that's presumably linked to what we're actually perceiving. But top-down processes are going the other way. So we see what we see based on expectations, memory, language, context. So we're continuously shaping what we experience. And sometimes that's in surprising ways that diverge from just the raw sensory input. In fact, I would say that this is always what's happening. And so we're in the realm of what we would call perceptual inference. what we take our knowledge to dictate what we see. And so I hope to present some demonstrations, effects, and I'm going to focus on color toward the end. But I want to show how color, well, not just color, but how context and cognition alter what we see. And I just have some simple examples of that. And I was thinking this for the high school students or anybody who might want to go into vision. A lot of these issues are unresolved. I mean, we know about the effects, but in many ways, we're still trying to figure out how it works. And so this is left in many ways for you. And so I want to start with just something like this to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So if you look at this pattern, you see a bunch of innies and outies, and we talk about belly buttons being innie and outie. Well, so if you look at this, you have patterns, and these things either go in or out. Anybody have any thoughts about why they might go in or out? And so just to make a long story short, you'll notice that some of them pop in, some of them pop out. For most of us, something like, I don't know if you can see my pointer. It's very tiny on this computer. But there are some that pop out, and you'll notice that they have the light at the top, and some that are going in, and they have the light at the bottom in terms of this gradient. And the reason it works this way is because of an assumption, a bit of knowledge that we have, which is that usually light comes from above. And so there's nothing in the physical stimuli that really differentiates the ones with the gradient going from light to dark versus dark to light, except for the fact that something inside of us says light typically comes from above. So this is a top-down process. It pops out because of something inside of us versus it goes in because of something we know. When light comes above, the shadow's at the top. If it goes in, the light's at the top if it goes out. So we have this prior, this inference. We make, automatically make this perceptual inference. And I think one of the most powerful examples of this is what we call the hollow head. And so if I can show that, the hollow head, and maybe some of you have seen this before, but I'm going to show it again. And so this is just a mask. It's a mask of the late great silent film star Charlie Chaplin. And so this is just the normal view of it. But then look what happens. As you look at the back of the mask, what happens? Something in us forces it to pop out like a normal face, even though it's completely inverted. And so with the normal mask, it's not a problem. But nearly all of us, when it turns around, and this is a powerful demonstration of what we call top-down processing, we have inside of us knowledge of what faces do. And so you show something that looks like a face stimulus, and because of what we know, we force it in our mind's eye to pop out like a normal face. It's an absolutely profound demonstration. This is from the late great Professor Richard Gregory. And so this notion of top-down processing looms quite large. And so if we now move on, so what I'd like to do is get this back to, there we are. Oh, and there's plenty of examples of this in vision. And so here's another nice example. If we look at these two faces, we see our former, from the United States, our former president, Barack Obama, and they look like fairly normal upside down faces. And yet, what happens when you put it right side up? What you see is something absolutely profound, which is, it looks a little bit odd like this, but when you put it right side, it's the same exact stimulus, only right side up. And you'll notice that one of these faces is profoundly off because the eyes and the mouth are turned upside down. All of a sudden, in contrast to the upside down picture, the right side up picture, what you see is the one on the left is absolutely hideous compared to a normal face. And again, this speaks to the top-down processing. We have a schema for what faces are supposed to look like. And when we see something, when we're looking at a normal face, not an upside down one, something in us amplifies in our mind's eye that which is off. So it's another great example of what we call top-down processing. There's plenty of other examples. One of the things you might have noticed is if you ever try to if you're out in nature, maybe you're at the beach or somewhere, and the sun or the moon is rising above, or the sun is setting, depending on where you are, it looks really large. But again, it's a trick of your mind compared to when it's in the center of the sky. So on the horizon, something in us, even though these are the same size, something makes the moon or the sun setting on the horizon much larger in our mind's eye. It has nothing to do with the physical stimulus and everything to do with amplification going in us. Something in us says that thing, the horizon's really far away, and so this thing that's behind the horizon must be giant. And so we cause it to look much bigger. And then there are also examples, and I'm just trying to see, maybe you've seen this before, but another nice example of this has to do with the opposite, which is that a lot of times if something's not in context, let me just show you. And I think probably everybody who's here now has seen this, but I'd like to show it anyway. Selective attention. So your mission in something like this is to, what you're looking at, you're going to see two teams, one in black, one in white, and your mission is to count the number of times that the team in white passes the basketball. And if you've seen this before, let's just let this go. So what you can see is count how many times the player wearing the white passed the basketball. Okay. Now, just out of curiosity, is there anybody in the audience who's never seen this before? I suspect everybody's seen this before. But the point is in context, you don't typically see this, but many people miss the fact that in the process of watching this, a gorilla has actually walked through in a suit. And so if you're selectively attending to passing the basketball, you might have missed the fact that there was a gorilla that walked through. And so again, it speaks to this notion of, and in this case, it's not necessarily clear just how much of that gorilla is processed, but these are classic top-down sorts of phenomena. And there's so many more, but what I'd like to do at this point is point out that, yeah, so we have plenty of examples where this is beyond the simple bottom-up normal processing where you're trying to where you're looking at how the physical stimulus relates to the processing of internal mechanisms. Now we're talking about things that are clearly determining what we see based on what's happening in us. Probably the most extreme example, if you're interested in things like clinical psych, you might have, we have something like the Rorschach ink blot test. And, there's some questions about just how reliable it might be or how accurate it might be. But you can look at ambiguous figures and something in you causes you to see coherent images, and that's the test. The fact is that we have a lot in us that will attempt to use our higher order processing to try to do perceptual inference. We infer what's present, and so we see what's happening based on not what's coming in, but rather what's happening in us. And so that's the basic idea of top-down processing and perceptual inference. Well, with that in mind, and again, I want to be mindful of the time, I wanted to say a little bit about color and how there's quite a bit of inferential processing, even in something like color. And so maybe if you're coming here not thinking, maybe if you haven't studied color a lot, you might think of it as being very much related to what's in the physical world. But in fact, there's a lot of processing that goes on from the receptors on that influences what we see. But what I'm going to show you is that there's a lot, again, that's highly inferential. So the idea is a lot of what we see is again based on sort of top-down sorts of processing. And just to give you this idea of color inference. Now, what you see here is a white page or a white screen, and the only thing on it are purple and yellow lines. But as you stare at this, you probably see what looks like a yellow, translucent, lightly translucent yellow patch. It's called the watercolor illusion, because in fact there is no translucent yellow going across that surface. It's complete inference. So you take the yellow at the edge and something in you spreads that yellow color. Again, it's a profound example of inference as opposed to some sort of low-level property of the object. If you take a photometer and measure the light in these areas here, these light areas, and the same with these areas here, you'll find that in fact this surface and this surface are identical, and the difference is perceptual. There's an inference that's taking place. And there's plenty of examples of this as well. And so this is called neon spreading. So again, all you have on this screen are lines. You have circles, and yeah, the circles turn blue here. And you have these squiggles, and the squiggles turn blue here. But in fact, most of us see what looks to be a translucent, transparent surface of blue, and it's just not there. It's the product of inference. And sometimes this gets really dramatic. So in the case of this lime green, you get this clear disc with it looks like there are edges here. There are no edges. It's almost like, we're sort of in this realm of if you remember the old movie, The Matrix, where there is no spoon. Well, there is no edge. It's just a product of what you created. And of course, probably the most dramatic example here is, in this case, the dress illusion. And again, I guess, so are there only 5 people here? Is that right? Or are there's quite a few? Okay. Well, I'm always curious, like if you've never seen this, I'm just curious what colors people see when they look at this dress. And then
I'm asking more directly, David, sorry. So in the audience, please write in the chat who said the dress, which color you say the dress. The dress is 2 colors, and then you can write on the chat which kind of color are you seeing.
I can't hear myself.
Please do.
When he's talking. Maybe your audio is low.
I don't hear it.
You don't hear me? Okay, now we have one Giada Golfetto, brought blue and nero, black and blue, 3.
I don't hear anything.
There is anyone that see the dress gold and white?
Let's see.
Yes, Ellen, gold and white, beige and white, gold and white, blue and gold. So, David, can you hear me?
Now I can, yeah.
So I asked 2 people, and there is a variety of answer. So
okay.
Several blue and black, but some gold and white, some beige and white, some blue and gold. So as you can see, as expected, there is, let's say, interpersonal differences.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And this is very common, right? So with even a few people, it's always nice to see that these sort of things happen. And so, for instance, as you look at this, again, there's a number of examples of this, but I think there's a number of things to notice and discuss about this. So, and these are other examples. So, for instance, some people will see dramatically different colors in this. And so, for instance, I see a charcoal black sweater with a sort of a copper brown colored symbol here, and these stripes are copper and brown, whereas some of you are going to see dramatically different things. Some of you are going to see colors like green, and you might see pink or whatever colors. And again, I'm going to skip this one since it's just like the dress. But this is the shoe. And if you're like me, the shoe is a reddish pink. But if you're like most people, it's a purple. Or I'm sorry, it's a gray. And then if you're like me, you see these stripes as being white. But many of you are going to see something like a sea foam or very light green or greenish blue. And so there's huge individual differences in all of this. And you might wonder what's happening here. And again, in the interest of time, and people have wondered about this a lot. Well, one of the things I'd like to point out is you only get these effects when you see an object. I mean, there are similar effects, but these dramatic changes in color, these dramatic individual differences require that you have some idea of what the object is that you're looking at. In all these cases, you have a shoe, you have sandals, you have a sweater. And so that's one of the necessary ingredients. You have to identify the object before the effect happens. And then once that's happened, the actual lighting, when you think about what's happening with color, and what you have coming in is you have light, and that light bounces off an object, and some of that light goes into your eye. But then what you have disentangled are the properties of the light and the properties of the object. So the light hitting your eye is a mix of the illuminant, that which is lighting the object, and that which is the surface of whatever light's coming off of. And this is inherently ambiguous. Our visual systems have to work overtime to separate out or to understand what the illuminant is. And once that happens, they can assign the color. But when the illuminant in these objects is highly ambiguous, if you look at that dress, is the light coming from behind? Is it coming from above? Is it bouncing off a wall? We automatically, each of us makes a decision about what we think is happening with the light. And depending on that decision, we see very different things. And so this assignment of color is following essentially cognitive processing. You have to decide what you think the light is doing before you can assign a color. And depending on what your decision is, the colors can be drastically different. So again, this is speaking to what each of us knows might be different. We might know different things about the light coming down onto the dress. We make automatic unconscious assumptions about what that is, but then the color's a product. So again, it speaks to this higher order nature of what's happening with color. I guess I didn't put the slide here, but when we study things like color, we find out that there are things like memory colors. So for instance, if I show you the picture of something like a banana, and I might show you black and white pictures of a banana, and I might have you set the color. I won't tell you it's black and white. I might show you different variants of it. But one of the things that we find is that for known objects, apples, oranges, bananas, people actually, even though there's no chromaticity, nothing chromatic about the images themselves, there's a slight effect where people actually perceive color in those objects. You know, a banana should be yellow. And so you see a little bit of yellow in the banana. You know that the apple maybe should be red, and so you see a little bit of red. And so these are effects, these are clearly cognitive effects. Higher order, you know something about an object, and that causes you to see a bit of color in that object, which leads to another related issue. Again, this only happens when you actually can see objects. If you look at this, you see a bunch of images of strawberries with a bunch of different backgrounds. So you see a green or a teal background, a lime green, and so with each of these backgrounds, you look in here and you see these berries, these strawberries, and they look a bit red. They don't all look identical to each other, but they all look a bit red. And the point is that if we actually just took away the colored backgrounds, we'd see that each of these strawberries is actually not chromatic at all. It would look gray to us. The color is a product of our knowledge that the berries should be red. And this is a specific example of this thing called color constancy. We take objects, we put them in all sorts of different lights, and they tend to look the same. They tend to have the same colors. And it's not perfect. There's deviations from this. But the fact is, something in us knows, based on what the object is, what the color should be. And then we actually make sure it stays that color perceptually. And this, again, it requires you to actually see and identify an object, and then the color is assigned. In this case, these berries are gray, and yet we see them. I mean, if we just took them in isolation, we'd see gray. But, and yeah, so in some cases they look more yellowish, sometimes they look more greenish, and yet there's a constancy to them. Which brings me to the last phenomenon.
And again, maybe we can stop a minute here, because you already presented a lot of interesting, or maybe you want to do also this, but I think let's ask to our students if they want to some explanation in some part, because you already presented maybe 6 or 5 or 7 very intriguing and captivating illusion. And so please ask question to our student. I want to make also a comment to all. Here in the Department of Physics, which is in Sesto Fiorentino, via Sansone 1, we have an exhibition of optical illusion, exactly for the purpose that David is saying, that any optical illusion is a kind of small experiment that point out some mechanism in our brain, which is a top-down process. And since I don't see any question now, I want to ask you, in this example you did with faces, I read in some article that this face recognition, or this memory that bring us to recognize a face in this case, is something you realize in the plasticity of the brain when you are very, very young, let's say from 0 to 2 years or something like this.
Massimo, I lost you for about 10 seconds, so I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, the question is that true that the memory that brings us to recognize a face is something you build up when you are extremely small? I mean, kids from 0 to 2 years.
And I think it's a great
And there is an example that we cannot recognize Oriental face, let's say Asiatic face, like Chinese and Japanese. We have some difficulty to recognize the characters, and they have the same effect looking at our faces. Is that something correct?
What I'm aware of is there's a number of things that I think relate to this. One is faces, especially a mother's face, is probably the stimulus that's the most recognizable, the earliest. So you can see prolonged looking at familiar faces, especially typically the mother. If a baby starts looking at something for prolonged periods, it's typically the face. So there's something about that face that's especially interesting. And then when you start seeing faces as they get older, they start looking at the novelty. Now, are they detecting racial differences, and are they unable to do these sort of top-down effects? I'm not so sure about that. I know that the development of face processing, typically, it's strongest for same race, and then at some point there's a response to novelty, and then there's interesting effects in terms, you can do things like what's called face adaptation, and you can look at one race of person and you can adapt to them. And what's interesting is the opposite effect is that you can see, and this happens after, I think, about 6 months of age or so, you can start seeing these opposite effects in terms of, so quote unquote opposite race effects, whether it has to do with color or with other features. I don't think I've answered your question, because I don't really quite know the answer. But
I read the paper that they tried to have some group of people where the babies are familiar with both, let's say, Caucasian faces and Asiatic faces. And this kind of baby, when they are adult, they can recognize easily both kind of races. While, let's say, European or American, I don't know, at least myself, I have some problem to recognize, I don't know, Asiatic faces. They look not exactly the same, but almost, let's say, the same. So And they point out that these occur when you are very young, so from 0 to 2 years. And then if you do the same experiment from 3 to 4 to 5, the effect is smaller.
Okay, that's interesting to know. When you were talking about this, I thought about some of the literature from socialist psychology and face recognition, like dealing with juries and identifying, people who were involved in crimes and things. And we know that facial recognition across races is notoriously poor.
Now, luckily we have a question from E or R, I don't know, Blairy. How can understanding top-down process improve AI perception system?
Well, I think you're already seeing it in things. So, for instance, as I've discovered, when you take a photograph of, for instance, a sunset or something in that will try to enhance it. So what's happening with a lot of I don't know if I'd even call this AI, but what happens is it does pattern recognition on photos, and once it can identify what the objects are, it can remove imperfections in the images, or it can make it more detailed. And so I think what you're seeing is with a lot of AI, when you give it a photograph, it can, and you see these things now where you can actually take old photographs and cause the people in them to dance and move around and smile, and so I think with that, with the pattern recognition that AI does, it's using these to modify and enhance images. So that's one way. Did you have any thoughts? I'm just curious if you had thoughts about how it might.
So Blair, if you have any thoughts, I would add this one, that there are several research lines in, let's say, medicine or ophthalmologists. They want to use some image of, I don't know, some radiography or some image of the eye. And with AI, they can improve resolution, they can improve diagnosis, they can see some, let's say, cancer or something with smaller doses of radiation. So there are very direction in improving imaging understanding.
Sure, absolutely, yes. So again, pattern recognition in very subtle ways, beyond what our eyes are specialized to do.
Okay, thanks, Blairy. Now the question section stop here, and you can move on. Then at the end, we will have some more questions.
Yeah, and I'll try to do this quickly because I was going to spend a lot of time, because when you first asked me to talk, we had talked about possibly talking about chromatic contrast and how this shows up in art. So I just really want to, and I'm going to, because of the work that Paulo Grasso and all of you are doing here, I wanted to say a little bit about this being more and more looking like it's a more higher order cognitive process, or the color. And so just to give you a sense of what this is about, if you look at these two patches, you see one that's surrounded by blue, one that's surrounded by yellow or gold. And most people, whether or not, whatever your color vision is, you'll probably say that this one on the left looks more yellow than this one on the right. This one looks more blue, this one looks more yellow. But the differences are solely a product of what's surrounding it. We call this simultaneous contrast. And so if you put the two together, you see that they're the same. It's totally a product of our visual system to perceive these as being different. And this is something, it shows up in all sorts of demonstrations. So each of these, you can see that the perception of color is completely dependent on the surround. And by the way, these are slides from Grasso et al., where this was studying it. Now, what's interesting about this study was that it looked at just a simple background, a slightly more complex background with a border, and also then identifiable objects, or in this case, this car. And what you'll notice, I don't know about you, but one of the things to notice is that, and exactly why and how this is true is something maybe we can discuss, and I think it's very much an open question. But if you look, for instance, I don't know about you, but I look, for instance, at H1, which is a car. Now that's super vivid in terms of, now that background is just as gray as any other gray background. It's as gray as what you see here. All these are gray backgrounds, but they all have color induced into them from the surround. And exactly what happens as things become more identifiable, more clearly discernible from the background, more real in terms of real objects as opposed to fake objects. It seems, and we're just looking at this, it seems that the more sort of interpretable it is, the deeper the chromatic effects. And the deeper the simultaneous contrast, and even though we're not talking about color constancy necessarily, I mean, because there's no inherent color to these cars, the effect is still quite vivid. And so this is something I think that people here were noticing and wanted to study. And I just want to point a few things out. So this is something that artists have known for millennia. And so just these are examples. For instance, this is from Van Gogh, and you might wonder, why is he making the ground blue, the field blue? And it's because typically the induced color is its complementary color. So you put gold next to blue, and it turbocharges the color of both of these. So the gold becomes more gold, the blue becomes more blue, but it's kind of interesting. And Van Gogh did this all the time, especially during his period in, I guess, Arles. You see this with the Night Cafe. You see this with Starry Night. These colors are bursting out because of the contrast. He did this with red and green as well. There's interesting things he did where he put a green background there. And what does it do? It makes the red on the face and the hat pop out. This is simultaneous contrast applied in Van Gogh's painting. The red beard looks so red because he's flecked green around it. And so these effects show up in painting quite profoundly. You can go through Van Gogh endlessly and you find these effects. He taught the same thing to Gauguin, who did very similar things where he would induce colors and turbocharge them with their adjacent colors. This actually goes way back. This is Michelangelo, and whether he knew I assume he must have known. And there were people like Da Vinci who wrote about these effects, and more recently Chevreul and others. But you can see that the gold and the blue are put adjacent to each other, and almost certainly to cause these effects. You can see it in Vermeer, where he's got this odd green hue that's on the wall back there. And of course, he's got the blue and the gold against each other. But that odd green hue makes this red clay pot just pop out. At least it would not pop out nearly as much if it didn't have the background. And there's plenty in Vermeer that shows this. I'm not gonna go through all of Vermeer's, although you can see that he loved to play with. So you oftentimes see this in architecture. It goes, even if you think of the most brilliant gold you've ever seen, you might see something like King Tut's mask. Most people forget that it's surrounded by this lapis lazuli, this blue. And the blue again, and I haven't subtracted it from these images, but you see in art going back millennia that people seem to be playing around with chromatic contrast. And lastly, what I just want to do is I want to show you, and again, we haven't run an experiment like this, but if you look at something like this, maybe you take a moment and you pick, you look at the center, and what's the stimulus around here that most closely, take a moment and pick which of these most closely matches the color or the spot that you see here. And if you pick, go ahead, take a moment and do it. And what happens? Most of you probably either picked this one or this one, maybe this one, and it's true, this is pure, this is gray. There's nothing chromatic in this for most of you on your computers. But now if we put a surround around it, so go ahead and now say, what's the color that you see? Go ahead and pick one of these, and I'll give you just a few seconds. So go ahead and try to find the dot that matches most strongly. And I don't know if you're like me, but there's huge individual differences. I typically, even though it's the exact same spot here, it turbocharges the color. So I put 5. So it's a bit more. There's a bit more red in this, and so this is a nice demonstration of it. But now let's and actually if we put a border around it like this, and this is again, these are my stimuli, but they're patterned after Grasso et al. From this year. And what you see is that something else, you can pick a number here as well. And I'm curious to see what you come up with, but for me, I typically pick the 5 again. But now let's put some meaning into this. I'm going to skip ahead just in the interest of time. And so you see here, there's a train here, and it's got the gray background. It may be a little bit darker than the spot you saw before. But now go ahead and figure out what color it is that you see. And again, the background's a little different than what you saw before. But I'm doing this to just show you something, which is that, so you have this identifiable object on an identifiable background. Now, maybe you've already picked the color. For me, I tend to pick, about a 10 or an 11. Maybe you did too. And the point being that it seems that when you have identifiable objects, even though it's not clear exactly what color the train should be, at least this is what seems to be the case, is when you actually know what the object is, when you know something about its background. This is an object. In this case, it's a train on a background. In this case, it looks like rails and a mountain. When you have this level of information, when you can identify the object, it also seems to turbocharge the color, in this case, the chromatic contrast. And so exactly what are the key features in this are worthy of discussion. I think we're just discovering these things. But so even something like chromatic contrast, which we used to think was related to something in the retina even, or maybe in the cortex, which is a very low level part of vision, it seems not to hold up. It seems to be that this is something that has to occur after we recognize the pattern, after we know something about the figure and its background. And then when that happens, the color deepens, the color after effect, or the color, in this case, the simultaneous contrast gets more vivid. And so with that in mind, I'm going to stop because I've already taken up a lot of your time, and I'll open it up.
Yes, thanks. Thanks. Very interesting. Many things to digest, let's say, for our students. And I think that someone can ask questions. Please do it, if you may. At the same time, we will start the discussion with our expert. The first is Michel. So please, Michel, you can ask question.
Massimo, Michel is not online this moment.
So Paolo, let's start with Paolo then.
Okay. Can you hear me? Mute.
Yeah. No.
All right. So thank you very much. First of all, David, it's a very fantastic topic. I know all this illusion. I knew already all the illusion that you showed, but
Paolo, take the microphone fixed. Paolo.
My question was basically on the fact on a consideration on your on what you showed us.
Paolo.
So basically, you showed us that our visual system can be easily deceived, actually. All right. So do you think that all this evidence of flaws in our visual system, that all this evidence can be considered flaws in our visual system, or do you think that they make sense in one way or another? I don't know if it's clear, my question.
Okay, and now I'm. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think I love the question. Are they truly flaws? Well, I think what they show is, I don't think that they're flaws. I think that they reflect the fact that we're not seeing the world as it is, but rather how we construct it. We're creating a model of what the world is outside of us. And so it's not direct realism. So we're trying to I mean, what you're seeing are, we can call them flaws, but they're not. They're actually, our attempt to make a model of the world based on what we know, interfacing with what's coming in. And so, and it's hard to say exactly how these chromatic contrast effects are involved in this. I think you have better ideas than I do on this, but I think that, yeah, they're not. I mean, sometimes you can find flaws, but in these cases, they speak to something that the system is trying to do. When it comes to things like faces, are they flaws? No, it's just that there's something in us that is emphasizing something that's important for our survival. You've got, you don't typically see a lot of upside down faces. You see a lot of right side up faces. And so we are programmed to notice exquisite detail in these things. And so to us, it's seamless. We notice an upside or a right side up face that looks a little bit off, and we get into this uncanny place with these oddly changed faces, and we don't necessarily consciously think about it, but no, it amplifies it. And I think the same is true of things like chromatic contrast. I mean, it may very well be, as you suggest, that it's involved in, this thing that creates color constancy. Color constancy isn't really a flaw, but it's a discrepancy between what's happening in the physical world, where the illuminant and the reflectance of the object are intermingled, and something in the visual system says, well, we're going to basically, sometimes we're going to discount information, or we're going to make it fit our theory. And so in some ways, perception is an opinion. It's a theory about the world that it may or may not be correct, but it doesn't. So I don't think that you're seeing flaws so much as attempts to fit a model that makes sense.
I want to ask something, to add something to this. So from physicists, as I am, what I understand is that our vision is not a measure of the physical world. We don't need to measure the physical world as an animal. We need to survive in the earth. So we need to avoid our predator. We need to catch the animals for eating. So indeed, physicists then, when they want to study the real, let's say, interaction between matter and light, they have to develop some new instruments that are more objective than our vision. The vision is not an objective measurement. It's something we develop to live in the world. So the purpose is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now let me see if there is Roberto. So let's put Roberto. And
hi, David. Can you hear me? Hi. I have a question related to what we have discussed yesterday. I was thinking about that the whole time. If I got it right, you had an experiment, or maybe Paolo did an experiment, in which you tried to simplify the scenario of the train. So you just use a simple stimuli instead of the train, and the effect is reduced. Is that right?
I think it actually, I mean, it's reduced compared to the real image. What I did was I took some, so what Paulo Grosso did was, they actually had cartoons of a car. And I just setting up and thinking about it, I thought, well, I'll just try something similar like a train. I don't know. I find for me, even going to that train, it has the same background as the simple circle. It actually, I find that there's less chromatic contrast than the real photograph of the train, but there's more than the simple standard circle with a surround.
Okay.
So it's somewhere in the middle.
Because my question was, what do you think is the main difference between the scenario? Maybe when you move to some ecological context, some other process kicks in, or it's just a fact that depending by how you design the stimuli, you have different things of chromatic contrast or different magnitude of?
I don't think we know the answer yet. What exactly is the higher order feature? Could it be? And I think that these new experiments are knocking at the door. And I think that there are also other people who've sort of been able to show that there's something higher order, but it could be just the fact that it's complex. It could be, and I think that may be a component based on this earlier stuff. I think it could be the fact that it's clearly an object on a background, which then reduces the amount of guesswork you have to do. You know, with the simple, I mean, so that's another possibility. So with the simple gray circle with a circular background, you know, your system doesn't know, is this is the gray patch self-luminous, like, or is it actually, is it like an aperture, or is it a surface? And all this is ambiguous. And this is, if we're going way back to the days of Jacob Beck, which was 45 years ago, he made a big deal about the system making a decision about whether something's a surface or an aperture. In other words, is it self-luminous? Does it light itself? Or is it a surface that's being reflected upon? I think all of these things, and is it an interpretable, identifiable object versus is it something that is ambiguous? I think the more and more certain it gets, I think, so it could be all of these effects, and I just don't know the answer to it yet. I think it's the perfect question. I think colleagues here are the ones who are thinking a lot about what this could be right now. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts is that we are doing some experiment about adaptation, even in a very simple scenario like color adaptation or numerosity adaptation, and we expect the typical rebound effect. Then by chance, still Paolo, discovered that if you change the color of the stimuli between the adapter and the test stimuli, so between the adapting and the adapted stimuli, if the color is different, the effect vanished almost, or is reduced by 2/3. So the point is that most of the time when you are in the lab settings, in a very simplified scenario, you are missing components that might play a key role once that you are a more complex or a more ecological scene. So the experiment that I would like to do would like to go from a very simple scene in which you just have a rectangle and, for example, a uniform background, to the train with the several steps in which you introduce a first level of complexity, then a second level of complexity, and see what the correlation is between the increase of complexity and the amount of effect that you can get. That would be the perfect experiment that I feel like suggesting to the guys at the physics department at the moment.
Yeah. Right. Adding different elements and sort of trying to control other extraneous variables as much as possible, like spatial frequency or space average luminance. Or
yes, and I mean, it's not that it has to be a linear relationship. Maybe you just have a sort of pedestal in which nothing happened, and then at some stage you have a swap, and then you jump to another level of adaptation. That would be really interesting, because this is something that I have been bumping on several times in the last few times. I mean, it's really different from a real image from a simplified image. And sometimes in the search for a full control of the stimuli in the image, and so this idea that you have to reduce as much as possible the variables so you can control them in a very accurate way, we are losing something. We are losing components that actually are important in the ecological scenario. So this is the reason why I'm so attracted by this illusion. It's not like, a triangle on a circle or something like that. There is something there that looks really, really interesting, but it might be interpreted in several different ways. It's just complexity. Maybe you just add some noise in the scene and everything is fixed up, or maybe you need to have something that you have to interpret it, like, okay, this is a train, but there is a bridge and there is a background and you have a foreground. Maybe these kind of things are important as well, and are all features or dimensions that are completely lost if you just present geometric image or things like that. So I will push on this point, because I think it's really important, not just for color contrast, but in general for the way we design experimenting perception.
Right. And I mean, ultimately, I think, this idea that what you're doing, the task, can affect what you see.
Yes.
task parameter. And so if you're just identifying, or if you're just, by adding these different parameters, you can actually link specific tasks to the effect, right? Or processes. Am I hearing you properly, or
Yep.
yeah.
Now,
Yeah,
and the other question is, this is a methodological question that I would like to ask you. In most of these experiments, what you're doing is just to ask for a sort of, let's say, magnitude estimation. It's something like that. So you have to choose in a panel the color that match as close as possible the color of the train. What do you think about introducing a two alternative force choice? Something like, is this color closer or further away from the color
Yeah.
of the test?
This
Just to
I mean,
control the criterion.
This is exactly what we're discussing now, and I think the next studies are going to incorporate these things, and other people can speak more to this, but that's exactly where we're thinking, is moving this into the realm where you have even a single force choice. Does it match? Doesn't it? Something where you can take more classical signal detection and factor out issues like criterion. That's what you're thinking, is that right?
Yes. Criterion from D prime. You want to disentangle them.
So controlling certain variables like criterion could this be a criterion effect? That's something.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this tends to be a little bit technical for our audience. So they probably miss some points we are discussing. So I want to go back to some general question, David. So what you said is different between top-down and bottom-up processes, and you did a lot of very nice examples from top-down. So now I start to have a little example from bottom-up vision. For instance, yesterday Paolo remember us that Oscar Wilde said that the is in the brain that the poppy is red. So I would say that any color is a brain, let's say, interpretation of reality. Color doesn't exist in nature. What do you think?
I agree. Color is not a physical property. There are attempts to link it to physical properties like surface reflectance properties, but it's not. Color it's not that. It's not a wavelength. I mean, you can show certain properties, and depending what you do, you can change those properties. So it's not. I tend to agree with that. To make a long story short.
Do you have any good example of bottom-up process in vision?
No. I like to say no, because I think there's no question that information influences what we see, but ultimately, whenever I look down any of these rabbit holes, it seems like there's some sort of top-down process at the end of it. It's an opinion. So I can ask you that question. What do you think is a good example of bottom-up that holds?
Well, for instance, I was thinking before doing the question, and I was thinking if you do a photograph, then this is a kind of, let's say, a bottom-up process, because your photon goes in the, let's say, CCD, and then you have. But then when you look at the photo that you have done, then again, it's a bottom-up. You are interpreting the photo. So doing a photo is a bottom-down, but it's not in the brain. It's on the cellular or in the camera. But then you have to look at that, otherwise you did nothing. And when you look at, again, you are interpreting what you are looking, or not.
Again, you have to. I think it's an interpretation, right?
So Roberto, do you have a bottom-up processes to tell us?
In the field of perception, this issue has been tackled several times, and one of the maybe easiest example that I can make is a size perception. So the idea is that you can have a lot of illusions about size, and there was this idea. The idea was that if you look at an image in which there is the Ebbinghaus illusion or the Ponzo illusion or whatever, there was this hypothesis. So the primary visual cortex, the first area that receives the inputs from the retina, should represent the world as it is. So it should be very close to the physical properties of the world. But then the consciousness that is somewhere in the brain should have a representation that take into account, for example, contextual effect, the effect of the other stimuli and so on. So they were expecting V1 to reproduce the physical size of the object and the other part of the brain to reproduce the perceived size of the object. They did the experiment in fMRI and it came out that V1 represents the perceived side of the object. So I have no answer because at this point we don't know if this is because other area project have a feedback projection on V1 or if V1 itself is capable of doing this process and considering even the stimuli. I actually don't know. It looked like a very simple question, but it's very complicated and nobody, I think, has an answer at the moment.
If I may add something to this,
please try to fix the.
Yes, can you move to your okay? No, yes. Sorry, because we are in the same room, so there are some audio issues. But yes, so related to this topic, I would say I would like to add. I don't know if David agreed and David Roberto also must agree that a bottom-up process might be the one in which there is no uncertainty. So I would say that the top-down effects are mainly present when there is an ambiguous information from the scene. And for instance, when David was asking was showing the mask, the rotating mask, I was thinking, what about if I look at this the same mask not through a monitor in which my depth perception is impaired? Do I see the same illusion or not? So this is a question, and maybe the answer is not. So if you lose depth perceptual cues, for instance, you may lose top-down mechanisms in that specific illusion, and the same may, but this is a question for David or for whoever wants to answer. But maybe yes. So the uncertainty is very important for top-down to occur. Do you agree, David?
I think so, and I think what we're doing with this notion of top-down is we're turning it into something that alters what's coming in to fit some model. So in that context, yeah, I'd say that sounds good to me. Bottom-up doesn't. I mean, in some ways, what I keep doing with it is I keep turning it into. It's like I keep trying to make it into direct realism, which is not quite right. And so that's where I get in trouble with all of this because, from my perspective, at best, and again, I'm getting away from your point, so I will go back to it. But I think at best, perception is and it's not, but it's a replica of what's outside. It's an attempt to model it, but we know, I don't know if there's this notion of the interface theory of perception. It's actually what you're seeing is at best a replica, but it's even not that. I mean, there's so many deviations from it, which is why and so many of these are driven by higher order concerns. But again, I'm getting away from your point.
So if I understand correctly, you said that top-down process may apply also when there is no uncertainty. So the image, for instance, if we are talking about visual system, is very clear.
Yeah, Paolo, I would say that. Can you hear me? Yeah. I would say that, of course, optical illusion is always a top-down process because, I mean, in that case, you have multiple choice and usually you get the wrong response or let's say the non-reality response. So this. Now I'm curious of another aspect. So there are any illusion to the other four senses we have. So there are tactical illusion or ear illusion, there are sound illusion, there are other illusion for the other way we understand the world, or the illusion are only for the visual part?
Oh, I mean, other senses? You mean?
Yes.
Oh, sure. There's illusions for all the other senses.
Also for tactical illusion, or
Sure. Can
can you give us some example?
I think one of my favorite. Well, I've done all this stuff with phantom limb. People who lose an arm or a leg will actually feel the phantom. It's like it's still there. So that's a pretty good example of an illusion where you you can do things like the rubber hand illusion, if you've heard of that, where you can, if I stroke your hand, but then you also see somebody stroking a rubber hand, and then you hit that hand, you'll jump about 3 feet. Some people will actually even experience a little bit of pain.
But this is vision. I see.
Oh, I'm
this.
sorry. Yes, let me go to a tactile illusion.
Yeah.
If you and you may want to try this with somebody. You take a hand and then you put somebody else's hand with that, and then you stroke both sides. So it's as if you're stroking both sides of your finger, but in fact you're stroking somebody else's finger. You get what's called the dead hand illusion. It feels like your hand is dead because you're seeing it being stroked, but you're not feeling anything. So again, it's I mean, there is the interface with touch. I'm just trying to think of pure touch illusions, but that's a pretty good one because you're seeing it being stroked, but you're not feeling it being stroked. And so your hand has this sort of numb, dead feeling to it. Let's see, pure tactile illusions.
Roberto?
Touch is, I can come up with auditory and smell, but I can't come up with pure touch.
Well, some of the there are visual auditory illusion for sure. One of the best is the one proposed by Secular and collaborator, in which if you have two discs that move one against the other, you just perceive a sort of transparency motion. But if they are, when they are very close, you add a click, then you got the idea that they are bouncing, just because the click introduced the interpretation that something is colliding against each other. And so this is quite very famous. Other illusion as the rubber hand was the one that I was suggesting as well. Otherwise, there are some very technical things. I don't want to go on in that, but if you have a sound with a square waves, then you have a glitch. It is just because you're not ramping the sound over there. And so whenever you have an abrupt change in frequency or whatever you want, you have the adding of an extra very high pitch to the things. So it's a very small illusion, but it's something that we can easily reconstruct, for example, in MATLAB by designing stimuli.
Auditory.
My question was this one. I thought that I was wrong. That since vision is the most important sense in humankind, so we know the world mostly from vision, while other animals, for instance, dog, use the nose to understand the vision. So, I mean, if the most important sense is the one that you can have some guess what is happening based on memory, based on top-down effect, maybe in a dog you may have some more important illusion for let's say for olfactory or whatever it is.
Sure. Well, I don't know what it would be, but why not? Yeah.
But for
Okay,
instance,
sorry?
No, I was. Can you mute this one?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, for instance, Massimo, it's true that the you have to mute the. Okay, so it's true that the visual system is the most important, for sure, the most important sense, but for spatial information. For instance, temporal information, audition is the most important, also in human. So, for instance, and you can deceive also that sense with several illusions. I'm thinking, for instance, to the so-called three-tone paradox, which is an infinite ascending tones. So it looks as if there is a tone that is infinitely ascending. It's an illusion because it's not possible to have an infinite ascending tones, but this is an example of how, despite in this case, in that specific case, the audition would be very sensitive also in humans, can be still deceived. So
Okay. So
without going into animal world.
as you know, Paolo, then you have to show me the effect sooner or later.
Of course. I will let you try the effect.
Anyway, let's stop here. Let's thank David, all our expert, and
Thanks.
so to our students, thanks to be here, and we will see in a couple of weeks. I don't know exactly, maybe 3 weeks. So see you. Bye.